Winter 1883, Montana Territory. While his neighbors stacked cords of firewood against their cabins, preparing for the brutal months ahead, James Holbrook was building something they'd never seen before. Against the south wall of his cabin, he was constructing what looked like a shed made entirely of glass. Salvaged window panes, old paper stretched over wooden frames, every surface designed to let sunlight through. His neighbors gathered to watch, shaking their heads. They called it foolish. They called it a waste of good glass that could have been used for actual windows. They called it Holbrook's glass shed, and the name wasn't meant as a compliment. But James Holbrook understood something about the sun that most frontier settlers had never considered. He understood that light doesn't just illuminate, it carries heat. And if you could trap that heat, store it, channel it where you needed it, you could stay warm without burning a single log. Today, we're uncovering the story of a frontier innovation that was more than a century ahead of its time. This is the story of how one homesteader applied principles of passive solar heating that wouldn't become mainstream until the 1970s energy crisis. This is the story of the glass shed that heated a Montana cabin to 80 degrees on the coldest winter days, using nothing but sunlight. This is the story of James Holbrook and how he proved that sometimes the best fuel is the one that costs nothing at all. James Holbrook was born in 1845 in upstate New York, the son of a carpenter and a schoolteacher. His childhood was spent in a household that valued both practical skills and scientific curiosity. His father taught him to work with wood, to understand structure and joinery. His mother taught him to read, to question, to seek understanding beyond tradition. Young James grew up during a time of tremendous scientific advancement. The principles of thermodynamics were being formalized. The nature of light and heat was being explored. Glass manufacturing was becoming more efficient and affordable. These weren't abstract concepts in the Holbrook household. They were discussed at the dinner table, experimented with in the workshop. When James was 12, his father built a small greenhouse behind their New York home. It was a modest structure, just 8 feet square, designed to extend the growing season for vegetables. But young James became fascinated by how warm the greenhouse stayed, even on cold spring mornings. He'd slip inside before dawn and feel the retained heat from the previous day's sun. He'd watch frost on the ground outside while warmth lingered in the glass enclosed space. His father explained it simply. Glass lets light in but slows heat from escaping. It was a basic principle, but it planted a seed in James's mind that would grow over the next 2 decades. In 1870, at 25, James married Clara Bennett and they decided to head west. The Homestead Act was still luring thousands to claim free land, and James saw opportunity in Montana Territory. They arrived in 1872, claiming 160 acres in a valley that offered good water and shelter from the worst winds. The first years were spent in survival mode like every homesteader. Build a cabin, break ground, plant crops, survive the winter, repeat. James proved to be a capable farmer and an excellent carpenter. He took odd jobs building structures for other settlers, earning money for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. But Montana winters were brutal in ways that New York winters hadn't been. The cold was deeper, more sustained. The wind was relentless. Firewood, while more available than on the treeless plains, still required constant labor to cut, haul, split, and stack. James calculated that he and Clara burned through nearly 8 cords of wood each winter, and even then the cabin was barely comfortable. The fireplace heated the immediate area around it, but the far corners of the cabin stayed cold. At night, even with the fire banked, temperatures inside would drop close to freezing. They slept under piles of blankets, wearing layers of wool. It worked, but it was exhausting, and James kept thinking about that greenhouse in New York. The idea came to him in the spring of 1882. What if he could capture the sun's heat during the day and use it to warm the cabin, not with a fire, not with fuel, but with the sun itself? The challenge was that Montana winter days were short and often cloudy. You couldn't rely on consistent sunshine. But when the sun did shine, even on the coldest days, James noticed something. The south wall of his cabin, the one that faced the sun's arc across the winter sky, would warm noticeably. Snow would melt off it hours before melting anywhere else. The wood would feel warm to the touch even when the air temperature was well below freezing. The sun was providing heat, but it was being wasted. It hit the wall, warmed it briefly, and then dissipated into the air. What if you could capture that heat, store it, prevent it from escaping? James sketched designs through that spring and summer. His concept was simple in principle, but would require careful execution. He would build a structure against the south wall of the cabin, essentially creating a second, outer wall of glass. The space between the cabin wall and the glass would be a buffer zone, an air gap that the sun would heat during the day. Instead of cold wind hitting the cabin wall directly, it would hit the glass first. The sun would warm the air in that buffer zone, and that warm air would insulate the cabin. But James's design went further. He planned to make the buffer zone accessible like a room. He'd put a door in the cabin wall leading into the glass shed. During sunny days, the shed would heat up dramatically. He could open the door and let that warm air flow into the cabin. At night or during cloudy periods, he'd close the door and the glass shed would act as insulation, a barrier of still air between the cold outside and the warm inside. It was elegant, it was simple, and it would cost almost nothing because James had a resource most homesteaders didn't: salvaged glass. For years as a carpenter, James had been collecting broken windows, cracked panes, any glass he could salvage from abandoned buildings or failed homesteads. Frontier settlements were littered with such debris. People would leave, taking only what they could carry, leaving everything else behind. James had accumulated dozens of window panes, various sizes, some perfect, some damaged but usable. He'd been storing them, not sure what he'd do with them, but knowing glass was valuable. Now he had a purpose for them. He also had oiled paper, made by treating heavy paper with linseed oil until it became translucent and somewhat weather-resistant. It wasn't as good as glass, but it let light through and was much cheaper. Where he lacked glass, he'd use oiled paper. The structure wouldn't be beautiful, but it would function. Construction began in late summer of 1882. James built a wooden frame against the south wall of his cabin, extending it about 6 feet out from the wall. The frame was 12 feet wide, matching the width of the cabin's south face, and 8 feet tall. He used salvaged lumber where he could and cut fresh timber where he needed strength. The glazing was the creative part. He had to fit various sized windows into the frame, filling gaps with oiled paper. It looked chaotic, a patchwork of different glass panes at odd angles, but each piece was carefully sealed to prevent air leaks. He built a slanted roof covered with oiled paper, angling it to catch maximum winter sun. The floor was simply the ground, but James laid down dark stones he'd collected from the creek. Dark surfaces absorb heat better than light ones, and he wanted every advantage. He cut a door through the cabin's south wall, creating access to the glass shed. Now the two spaces were connected, but he could control the flow of air between them. Neighbors watched the construction with bemusement. The Johnsons, whose homestead was a mile east, stopped by frequently to ask what James was building. When he explained it was a solar heater, they didn't understand. A what heater? They'd ask. James would try to explain about trapping sunlight, storing heat, using the sun as fuel. They'd nod politely, but their faces showed confusion and skepticism. The idea of heating with sunlight seemed impossible. Everyone knew you heated with fire. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. The mocking started when the structure was finished in early October. It looked strange, there was no denying it. A ramshackle construction of mismatched windows and old paper jutting out from the cabin like an architectural afterthought. It didn't match anything. It didn't look like any building anyone had seen. The Johnsons started calling it Holbrook's glass shed, and the name spread. People would ride by just to look at it, to shake their heads at the waste of glass. Glass was expensive, valuable. Using it for a shed instead of proper windows seemed foolish. And what was the shed even for? Storage. It was too flimsy for that. Growing vegetables. Not in winter. James didn't try to convince them. He knew the proof would come when winter arrived. And when it did in November 1882, the glass shed proved itself immediately. On the first clear, cold day with temperatures in the teens and a bright sun, James opened the door to the glass shed around mid-morning. Warm air poured into the cabin. Not lukewarm, not slightly less cold, but genuinely warm air, as if someone had opened an oven door. Clara looked at him in astonishment. The shed had heated to nearly 60 degrees, and it was only late morning. By early afternoon, the temperature in the glass shed reached 75 degrees. The cabin, with just the door open and no fire burning, warmed to 60 degrees, comfortable by frontier standards. James had put a thermometer in the glass shed to track temperatures. Over the following weeks, he documented what he was seeing. On sunny days, even when the outside temperature was below zero, the glass shed would heat to 70 or 80 degrees by midday. The dark stones he'd laid on the floor absorbed heat and released it slowly, keeping the shed warm even as the sun angle changed. Opening the cabin door allowed warm air to flow in, heating the living space without burning any wood. At night, James would close the door. The glass shed would cool down, but it acted as an insulation barrier. The cabin wall that used to face brutal cold wind now faced a buffer of still air, even if that air was cold. It was still a massive improvement. The practical impact was dramatic. James and Clara's firewood consumption dropped by more than half. They still used the fireplace for cooking and for nighttime heat, but they didn't need to keep it roaring all day. The glass shed provided free warmth whenever the sun shone. Even on cloudy days, the shed collected some diffuse light and provided some heating. Montana winters, while harsh, have many sunny days. The glass shed took advantage of everyone. By December, James calculated they'd burned less than 2 cords of wood, whereas normally they'd have used 4 or 5 by that point. The savings in labor alone was significant. Less wood to cut, less wood to haul, less wood to split and stack. Word started to spread, but not in the way James expected. The Johnsons came by in January, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but really to see if the glass shed was actually working. James invited them in. The cabin was warm, the fire was small, and when he opened the door to the glass shed, they felt the rush of warmth. Their skepticism wavered, but it didn't break. They acknowledged first it seemed to be working, but they still thought it was too complicated, too strange. Traditional methods were good enough for them. Other neighbors reacted similarly. Yes, it worked. Yes, it was clever. But no, they weren't interested in building one themselves. It was too different, too experimental. James didn't mind. He and Clara were comfortable. They were saving wood and labor, and they were learning how to optimize the system. James noticed that thermal mass helped. He added more dark stones to the floor of the glass shed. He painted the inside of the back wall, the actual cabin wall, with a dark stain to absorb more heat. He experimented with ventilation, finding that a small vent at the top of the glass shed helped prevent overheating on particularly sunny days. By the second winter, 1883-1884, the system was running even better. James had refined the design, fixed air leaks, replaced some of the oiled paper with actual glass he'd acquired. During that second winter, something unexpected happened. A traveling journalist passing through Montana on assignment for a Chicago newspaper heard about the glass shed and came to investigate. His name was Robert Finch, and he was writing a series on frontier innovations. He spent 2 days with the Holbrooks, measuring temperatures, documenting the design, interviewing James about the principles. His article, published in February 1884, was titled "Solar Heating on the Frontier, a Montana Homesteader's Ingenious Solution." It was enthusiastic, detailed, and it reached a much wider audience than James's immediate neighbors. The article brought letters from people across the country wanting to know more, asking for plans, inquiring if James would help them build similar structures. James responded to many of them, providing sketches and advice, but he wasn't interested in becoming a businessman selling solar heating systems. He was a homesteader and he had a farm to run. Still, the recognition was satisfying. His neighbors, who'd mocked the glass shed, now had to acknowledge that others thought it was valuable. A few even asked James for help building their own. He assisted when he could, sharing what he'd learned. Over the following decades, variations of James's glass shed appeared across Montana and neighboring territories. Some people built them correctly and experienced similar success. Others modified the design in ways that made it less effective, or they built them facing the wrong direction, or they didn't understand the importance of sealing air leaks. The results were mixed, but enough people had success that the concept persisted in the region as a known technique, if not a widely adopted one. It was seen as something clever people did if they had the skills and resources, but it never became standard practice. James and Clara Holbrook lived on their Montana homestead for the rest of their lives. James continued farming and carpentry. Clara raised their 4 children, all of whom grew up in a cabin kept warm by sunlight. The glass shed lasted for decades, requiring occasional maintenance, replacement of oiled paper, fixing of broken panes. It outlived James, who died in 1910 at age 65. Clara maintained it for several more years before moving to live with one of their children in town. The homestead was eventually abandoned, and the glass shed deteriorated. No trace of it remains today, but the principle James Holbrook demonstrated in 1882 was sound. It was passive solar heating, a concept that would be rediscovered and formalized nearly a century later during the 1970s energy crisis. When oil prices spiked and people looked for alternative heating methods, architects and engineers developed passive solar designs that were, in essence, sophisticated versions of what James had built. Sun spaces, solar rooms, trom walls, all variations on the same theme. Capture the sun's heat, store it in thermal mass, use it to warm living spaces, control it with careful design. The difference was that 1970s designs benefited from modern materials, better glass, improved insulation, engineering calculations. James had worked with salvaged materials and intuition, but his fundamental understanding was correct. The sun provides an enormous amount of free energy. Even in winter, even in Montana, a clear day delivers substantial heat. The challenge is capturing it, storing it, and using it when you need it. James solved that challenge with a 6-foot deep buffer zone made of glass and oiled paper. It worked. It worked well enough to cut his firewood use in half. It worked well enough to keep his family comfortable through brutal winters. And it worked without requiring any fuel other than sunlight. The story of James Holbrook's glass shed raises interesting questions about innovation and adoption. Why didn't this technique spread widely? Why didn't every Montana homesteader build one? Several factors limited adoption. First, it required specific resources. You needed south-facing wall space. You needed glass, which was expensive if you didn't have a salvage source like James did. You needed carpentry skills to build the structure properly. You needed to understand the principles well enough to avoid common mistakes. Second, it was different. Frontier culture was conservative in many ways. People stuck with what worked, what they knew, what their neighbors were doing. Innovation was risky. Failure could mean freezing to death. Most people chose proven methods over experimental ones, even when the experimental method had been demonstrated to work. Third, firewood was available in Montana. Unlike Unlike the treeless plains where settlers burned buffalo chips or twisted grass, Montana had forests. Cutting wood was hard work, but it was familiar hard work. The glass shed saved labor, but it didn't eliminate it entirely. You still needed some firewood for cooking, for nighttime heat, for cloudy periods. The value proposition was real but not overwhelming. It made life easier, not fundamentally different. For many settlers, that wasn't enough to justify the effort of building something so unusual. James Holbrook was unusual. He combined practical skills, scientific curiosity, willingness to experiment, and access to salvaged materials. That combination was rare. Most homesteaders had some of those attributes, but not all. And without all of them, building a successful solar heating system was difficult. Yet the principle remains valid. Passive solar heating works. It works in Montana, it works in many climates, and it requires no fuel. Modern homes incorporating passive solar design can reduce heating costs dramatically, sometimes eliminating the need for conventional heating entirely in moderate climates. The techniques have been refined: better insulation, precise calculations, optimized window placement, but the core concept is unchanged. Use south-facing glass to capture solar energy. Store it in thermal mass. Control heat flow to match your needs. James Holbrook understood this in 1882, applied it with the materials he had available, and proved it could work on the American frontier. Today, the site of James Holbrook's homestead is private ranchland. No markers indicate what happened there. The local historical society has some records: the land claim, census entries listing James and Clara and their children, newspaper clippings including Robert Finch's 1884 article. A few descendants still live in Montana, mostly unaware that their ancestor built one of the earliest documented passive solar heating systems in America. The story has faded from public memory, known primarily to a handful of historians interested in renewable energy and frontier innovation. But what James accomplished deserves remembering. In an era when heating meant burning wood, when innovation was viewed with suspicion, when resources were scarce and mistakes could be fatal, one homesteader looked at the sun and saw not just light but fuel. He built a structure that captured that fuel, stored it, and used it to keep his family warm. His neighbors laughed at his glass shed, called it foolish, predicted it would fail. It didn't fail. It worked winter after winter, decade after decade. It saved labor, saved resources, and proved that sometimes the most mocked ideas are actually the most brilliant. The glass shed wasn't perfect. It didn't eliminate the need for firewood entirely. It didn't work on cloudy days. It required maintenance and understanding. But it cut heating costs in half using nothing but sunlight and salvaged materials. That's remarkable by any standard, frontier or modern. James Holbrook didn't invent solar heating. Humans have been using the sun's warmth since prehistoric times. But he applied it in a novel way, adapted to frontier conditions, and demonstrated its viability in one of the harshest climates in America. His story also highlights the gap between innovation and adoption. Just because something works doesn't mean people will use it. Cultural factors, resource availability, risk aversion, and simple inertia all affect whether innovations spread. The glass shed worked brilliantly for the Holbrooks. A few neighbors copied it with varying success, but most continued burning firewood the traditional way, even though they'd seen proof that there was a better option. This pattern repeats throughout history. Innovations often take decades or even centuries to become mainstream, not because they don't work, but because human systems are slow to change. Looking back from our current era of climate change and energy concerns, James Holbrook's glass shed feels prophetic. He was using renewable energy before the term existed. He was reducing his carbon footprint before anyone knew what carbon footprints were. He was practicing sustainability because it made practical sense, not because it was fashionable. The motivations were different. He wanted to save labor and stay warm, but the result was the same: less resource consumption, more efficient use of natural energy, reduced environmental impact. Modern passive solar design has advanced far beyond what James could accomplish with salvaged windows and oiled paper. Architects now design entire homes around solar principles, with calculated angles, specialized glass, computerized energy modeling. But the fundamentals remain James's fundamentals. South-facing glass captures winter sun. Thermal mass stores heat. Careful design controls heat flow. These principles don't change, regardless of the sophistication of the implementation. James proved they work on the frontier with primitive materials. Modern designers prove they work in suburbs with cutting-edge technology. The physics is the same. Every time someone builds a sunroom, installs south-facing windows, or adds thermal mass to their home for passive heating, they're using James Holbrook's principle. Most don't know his name, don't know his story, don't know that a Montana homesteader demonstrated this in 1882, but the lineage is there, connecting a glass shed built from salvaged materials to modern sustainable architecture. Innovation rarely appears fully formed. It evolves, builds on what came before, adapts to new contexts. James's glass shed was part of that evolutionary process, a step between traditional heating and modern solar design. The neighbors who laughed at James Holbrook's glass shed were wrong, but their reaction was understandable. It looked strange. It was different. It challenged assumptions about how heating should work. Mockery is often the first response to innovation, especially innovation that seems too simple to be effective. How could sunlight and glass replace a roaring fire? It seemed impossible, but it wasn't impossible. It was just unfamiliar. And once people saw it work, many of them still didn't adopt it because unfamiliar remained uncomfortable. James died in 1910, never knowing that his glass shed would be viewed, more than a century later, as ahead of its time. He saw it as a practical solution to a practical problem. Winters were cold. Firewood required labor. The sun provided free heat. Combining those facts led to the glass shed. It wasn't revolutionary to him, it was common sense applied with care. That's often how the best innovations happen. Someone looks at a problem from a slightly different angle, applies principles in a new way, and creates something that seems obvious in retrospect but was invisible to everyone else beforehand. Today, when someone builds a passive solar home, they're validating James Holbrook's vision. When architects design net-zero energy buildings that heat themselves with sunlight, they're using principles James demonstrated with salvaged windows. When environmentalists advocate for renewable energy and sustainable building practices, they're echoing arguments James could have made in 1882, though he probably would have framed them in terms of saving labor rather than saving the planet. The motivations shift with the times, but the wisdom remains constant. The sun provides abundant free energy, and with clever design we can use it. The glass shed that neighbors mocked as foolish turned out to be anything but. It was practical, effective, and remarkably efficient. It kept a family warm through brutal Montana winters using nothing but sunlight. It saved countless hours of labor that would have been spent cutting, hauling, and splitting firewood. It demonstrated that with intelligence and effort, you could work with nature rather than against it. That lesson remains relevant, perhaps more relevant now than ever. In an age of energy crisis and climate change, James Holbrook's glass shed stands as a reminder that solutions often exist if we're willing to look beyond tradition and embrace ideas that others call foolish. The next time winter sun streams through your south-facing windows and warms your home, think of James Holbrook. Think of a frontier carpenter who looked at his cold cabin and saw a problem worth solving. Think of salvaged glass and old paper, carefully arranged to trap heat. Think of neighbors who laughed and a homesteader who proved them wrong. The glass shed worked. It worked so well that it should have changed how frontier homes were built. It didn't, not widely, not in James's lifetime, but the principle survived, evolved, and eventually found its place in modern sustainable architecture. Sometimes being right isn't enough to change the world immediately. Sometimes you plant seeds that grow slowly, taking decades or centuries to flower. James Holbrook planted such a seed in 1882. We are still benefiting from it today.